There was a study conducted a little while ago. Some of you might be aware of the study or heard of it before. And it was about the dangers of vending machines in the United States. It was conducted from about 1978 to 1995. And at that time, it found that vending machines killed twice as many people as sharks in the US. Twice as many people were being killed by vending machines than shark attacks in the United States. They did the survey, again, a similar survey a bit later, 2002 to 2015, and they found that the figure had doubled. Vending machines were killing 4 times more people in the United States than fatal shark attacks. For those of you wondering how the people died, it was not from heart disease or diabetes from the junk food in the vending machines. It was from the vending machines collapsing on the people because they were trying to get the food out of the vending machine. And you can only imagine the situation where perhaps the vending machine didn't give them what they believed they were owed. So they were trying to shake it or something. So vending machines, my friends, are way more dangerous than you might imagine. Now, why would I be talking about this? Well, today in the Gospel reading, Jesus is talking about prayer. And I believe that just as we might underestimate the danger of vending machines, perhaps we underestimate the danger of prayer if we approach it wrong. Prayer can be dangerous, and for some can be fatal to our spiritual well-being if we are not careful. Now, in the Gospel reading today, Jesus is talking about prayer. But for me, not so much teaching what to pray, but how to pray. In one sense, the how to pray will determine what we pray. If we see prayer as a vending machine, and I'm sure Father Vic or another one of the clergy preached on a similar topic with prayer and vending machines, but if we see prayer as a vending machine, we'll possibly make prayer requests as a transaction. You know, we put in our $2, we expect our bar of candy. If we don't get our bar of candy because it doesn't spit it out or get stuck, we feel cheated, betrayed. This is not right. We've been wronged. Maybe we get angry. We might kick the machine, we might shake the machine might fall on us. If we treat prayer as a vending machine, we've done our dues. We've paid our dues, we've done our duty. And here I am, Lord, I'm a good person, and I'm asking for just this one thing. I expect it. I'm owed it. Why won't you give me what I'm asking for? If we approach prayer like this, it can be dangerous, even fatal to our spiritual well-being, because that is not how prayer works. If we see prayer as a meeting of our hearts and minds with that of God, we approach prayer as an opportunity to be transformed as we align ourselves with God. We're not coming into a time of prayer to change God's opinion. We are wanting to align our hearts, our minds with that of God. And we are transformed in that process. Rather than being fatal, that is life-giving. So in the Gospel reading today, there's almost 3 parts to it. The first part is Jesus teaching the disciples the Lord's Prayer. And one of the disciples says, Lord, teach us to pray just as John taught his disciples how to pray. We want to know how to pray your way as well. That's the first part. The second part is then the parable, a parable of the shameless neighbour, or the parable of persistence. or as I like to think of it, the parable of the grumpy neighbour. Because I actually think the grumpy neighbour who's been woken up is the focus of this parable. So we have this parable, and then the third part is an exhortation, where Jesus says, pray, ask, seek, knock, don't hold back. So these are the three parts to this morning's reading. I'm really wanting to focus on the middle part, the parable of what I would call the grumpy neighbour. Now, a little bit of background. I'm sure many of you know this, but for those of you who might not be aware, if we look back at the first century, the world that Jesus lived in, obviously there weren't convenience stores. There weren't 7-Elevens, night owls, where we could make a quick dash to the shops to get what we need. Hospitality was also held in very high regard as a duty. Could bring shame upon a family if you weren't hospitable. Now, Aussies are pretty hospitable. We're pretty friendly. We're a friendly bunch. I'm not sure if we had a visitor rock up at like midnight, we would duck to the shops. We might say, well, we'll have a good breakfast, a good feed in the morning. Or we would scrounge around and pull something out because we have the luxury of fridges and larders. So hospitality was held in high regard. A visitor's needs, had to be met regardless of the time. Also, if we look at some of the houses, the simple houses in those days, single room apartments on 2 levels. The lower level, the living where the living would occur, the upper level was where they would sleep. And they would all sleep, the whole family would be sleeping together on that level. So when he says the children are already in the bed, they're all together. For security, they would put a bar across the door. During the day, the bar would be removed and the door would remain open. But at night, once that's been secured and the house was locked down, they were done for the day. So for the father or the mother, but for whoever to be woken up and to unlock the door is going to cause a disturbance for the whole household. So you can kind of appreciate to some degree the neighbour going, we're in bed. You're going to disturb the whole family. The bar is there. Not now. Not today. Come back in the morning. This is not my problem. But the problem was with the neighbour who was having the visitor. That neighbour was in a dilemma. They had no way of providing food for a traveller who had possibly travelled from afar and would be hungry. I'll go across to my neighbour and ask for 3 loaves of bread. It was a dilemma. Now, I do not necessarily believe that the lesson of this parable is so much about us needing to persist in prayer. We are encouraged to persist in prayer, but I don't believe that's necessarily the lesson from this parable. Because we persist in prayer, I believe, to be transformed ourselves. If we approach prayer not as a vending machine, saying, God, this is what I want, I've paid my dues, give me what I'm owed. But if we approach prayer as an opportunity to be transformed, persistence is good in that regard. So I don't know about yourselves, but I don't change very easily. I don't like change. And if I am, in a sense, asking God to change me, it's going to take a bit of work. Persistence in that regard is helpful. But persistence, I don't believe in this parable was about getting the grumpy neighbour to change his attitude. I don't think that is the lesson from the parable, that we need to batter at God's door until we finally compel God through weariness or frustration to give us what we want. As if we have to coerce an unwilling God to answer our prayer. George Caird, a 20th century English theologian, wrote once, God does not have to be waked or cajoled into giving us what we need. Many gifts he bestows on the ungodly and even the ungrateful. So then, if this parable is possibly not just about persistence for the sake of changing God's mind, what could this parable be about? Now again, many of you might be aware that the concept of a parable, the word, means to lay alongside. And so we can learn lessons from it lying two things side by side. We can compare and contrast. How are they similar? What can we learn from this that will inform this? Or maybe how are they different? And in today's parable, I believe it's not likening God to that grumpy neighbour. I believe it's contrasting God to that grumpy neighbour. What Jesus says is, if a grumpy neighbour and an unwilling householder can in the end be coerced by a friend's shameless persistence into giving him what he needs, how much more will God, our God, who is a loving Father, supply all the needs of his children? So I don't believe this parable is so much about likening God to the grumpy neighbour, and we need to persist and just keep knocking and bashing until God eventually, through weariness, goes, oh my goodness, don't you realise it's after 5 o'clock? Don't you realise I've down tools for the day? But because you have persisted, I will give you what you need, but grudgingly. I do not believe that is what this parable hints at. For me, this parable again points to the how of how we should pray. That we approach prayer to be transformed. We approach prayer so that we align our hearts and our minds with that of God. That we approach prayer with the mindset of faith and trust in our God, who is the source of goodness, our Creator, our benefactor, and who has our best interests at heart. And this is about the how, not the what. Jesus was teaching us how to pray. What is in our heart when we approach prayer? Now, Jesus does not necessarily promise that his disciples, that they will always get what they ask for. And we know that. We know that. That's very practical. We do not always get what we ask. But he does assure them that they will never seek, knock, or ask in vain. That God will always hear their and our prayers, and God will always answer our prayers. But we know that those answers may not always be in the way that we ask. But that is the wisdom of God. So Jesus' parable, I believe, reminds us that our prayers are not ringing gifts from an unwilling God, but going to the one who knows our needs better than we know them ourselves, and whose heart towards us is the heart of generous love. So how do we apply this in our lives today? How do you approach prayer? Do you approach prayer as a vending machine, involving a process of transactions which can be dangerous to our spiritual well-being if we feel that that transaction has not benefited us the way we thought it should, when we don't feel that we have been given what we are entitled to? That is a dangerous way of approaching prayer. Or do you approach prayer as an aligning of your heart and mind with God in whatever you are praying for? Whether you are praying for a loved one who is undergoing surgery, whether you're praying for someone who is dying, whether you're praying for peace in the world, whatever it might be that you are praying for, are you praying as a transaction, God, fix this? Or are you praying as a transformation process to align your hearts, your minds with that of God? Do you approach prayer as an opportunity to listen? Prayer can be silent. You do not need to use words. You could even just groan, because our God knows what is in our hearts, often knows what is in our hearts and in our minds before we even know. Our God knows what we need. We might know what we want, but God knows what we need. We don't need words, sometimes silence, and just listening to God speak to our need. So for me, I believe this passage today is a lesson from Jesus on how we should pray, not just what we should pray, and that the how is as important, if not even more important, than the what, because the how is about our relationship with God. And just as an aside, I believe Jesus is also teaching that there is no such thing as an unanswered prayer. We do not pray in vain. Jesus encourages us to seek, to knock, to ask. But just to, I suppose, to hold in our hearts that what we ask for may not be what we receive. But be rest assured that we know that our prayer is heard and will be answered in God's timing. Amen.